Um, Thank you very much for coming to my talk about players' valuations and value negotiations surrounding the Last of Us franchise, with a special focus on gender-related parts of the overall discourse. This is my outline for today. After some initial clarifications about my approach and where I come from theoretically, I will clarify briefly my kind of non-position in the already conducted gender-related academic discourse on games before I come to my approach on values, which is informed by the French sociologist Nathalie Heinig. In the main part, I come to my empirical material, which is most dear to me. Here I shine 3 spotlights, each on one level of operation of the discourse. First, on the discussions of individual characters in the game. Second, more meso level, on the actor's ascription of meaning to the text overall. And finally, on a very macro level, on the actors' valuations of their own discourse on gender-related issues. Hi. First off, I would like to describe my theoretical presumptions, or in simpler terms, what school of research I am from and how I look at games as research objects. I am originally a researcher of the study of religion with a cultural studies perspective on religions. Additionally, I dipped my toes a little bit into communication studies. From this viewpoint, I look at games predominantly through their relation on society and cultures. This viewpoint means methodologically that I follow an actor-centered empirical approach, meaning I look at text produced about games rather than the game texts. I apply discourse analysis to journalistic articles, players, comment threads, and conduct interviews with players. What is purposefully missing is my own analysis of the game or any game-related paratext of producers, studios, and marketing material. This approach is informed by Berger and Luckmann's social constructivist approaches, further developed by Keller, Knoblauch, and Reichert, into a communicative constructivist sociology. They highlight human communication as the center and originator of institutions, communities, and cultures. To say it with Berger's own words, every society has its own particular way of defining and understanding reality, its world, its universe, its ensemble of symbols. This is already predetermined in language as the symbolic basis of a society. On this basis, and with its help, a prefabricated typification system is created by means of which the countless experiences of reality can be ordered. This typification and its order are common property of the members of society, whereby they not only assume the character of objectivity, but are taken as given, as the world. Oh, show me the quote. Not happening. Where was I? Ordered. This typification, its order are common property of the members of society, whereby they not only assume the character of objectivity, but are taken as granted, as the world tout court, as the only world that the normal person can think of. This, in a nutshell, is the paradigm I follow. Additionally, I follow mediatization theory by Hepp and Haselbrink that enables investigation of the above described process in our current highly mediatized society. They argue that in order to understand the dominant communicative processes that occur and determine our worldview, the researcher must not look at one medium individually, but many media in their entanglement. In order to still be able to investigate feasible phenomena, they make use of Norbert Elias's framing of society in figurations rather than, for example, Bourdieu fields or Luhmann's systems. Figurations are more versatile than other frameworks and account for people's participation in multiple figurations at once and for the constant emergence and dissolutions. For example, gaming can be framed as a figuration, as Rade Antweiler and et al. Did when they developed the game environment approach to account for exactly that. Video games are especially deep entangled with other media. Their interactive nature and their multiplexity makes them difficult to grasp through more conservative means. Video games as artifacts enable people to interact with the game, its assets, but also to engage with other people about the game on other platforms and channels. This in turn leads to new and distinct forms of communication, community building and/or controversy and dispute. In short, the figuration of the formation of the environment figuration. It conceptualizes gaming as a figuration and focuses on the communicated processes that happen within it that in turn enable people to make sense of the world. This means for my own research that I conceptualize the Last of Us franchise as a figuration as well within the larger game environment figuration, but also with its overlappings with broader pop culture. Lemke too argued for the benefit of investigating franchises rather than certain platforms or media individually to observe delocalized social phenomena over a longer period of time. Here you see my conceptualization of the Last of Us franchise figuration and simultaneously my research design. First off, my case study is exclusive to the German discourse, just to keep it limited in scope. I analyze general media, I call them, you could also say mainstream media, it's kind of biased, and game media outlets, and players' comments on YouTube. Concretely, I focused on essay videos and Let's Plays, and discussion boards about the Last of Us franchise. I started with data from 2013 with the release of the first game, and the data sampling ended with the end of 2020 when The Last of Us 2 got the Game of the Year award, several Game of the Year award, not my primary one. Additionally, I interviewed players in their homes about their gaming experiences, which I conducted in early 2023, which coincidentally happened while the HBO series was airing. So, in all of this material, I found a lot of statements and discussions on the issues of gender. Of course, gender has been an object of rigor academic investigation for both gaming and the Last of Us franchise, especially. You see here, the latest is probably this one. There's also quite a lot of research on the negotiation of gender in the gaming discourse, especially since the cataclysmic events of Gamergate in 2014 and after. The key difference of my approach is, however, that I don't follow a gender studies or feminist approach. My interest is not on the issue of gender actually, but what values are negotiated on top of this topic. It serves more as another framework rather than the object of my research. I hope my material will explain what that difference means. However, much of my finding overlap with existing research, and I would love to discuss that later. But for now, I would like to focus on my actual central theory, which is the value theory by Natalie Heinig. What I mean with values and valuations, or what she means with values and valuations, and what definition she has of it. She understands values as products of and reasons for valuation processes. Instead of giving a definition, she developed a grammar I will introduce to this very simple example. Imagine a player says this: I play Skyrim all day long because the landscape is so beautiful. What is the value here? What is valued how? To what degree? For Heinig, valuation processes consist of the elements value worth, value object, and value principle. The value worth here would be me playing all day long, kind of measuring the degree to which I find it worth playing. It answers the question how much I value a thing. The thing in the example is the value object, Skyrim, the game itself, the reason why I'm doing evaluation right now at all. It answers the question, what is valuable? The last element is the one I'm most interested in, the value principle. Here it is the beauty of the landscape. It explains how the object achieved its worth. It answers the why question. Why do I value Skyrim with so much of my time? While Heinrich does not argue for a set list of values or value principles, sometimes found in other literature, she assigns value processes 16 categories of value registers, where she categorizes familiarities, this is following Weber, between value principles. For this example, the register would be beauty, or in the French original, it's esthétique. Here you see a list of all the registered, but I will not explain them all to you now. Instead, I present my findings along the relevant ones for today and explain them along the way. So finally, coming to The Last of Us. Before I come to my sample, a short introduction of the game. The first game tells the story of Joel and his ward Ellie on their way of finding a cure for the zombie infection. It is set in the zombie post-apocalypse and tells a father-daughter journey into the, again, wild West. And The Last of Us 2 plays many years after the events of the first game and centers around Ellie's fight against the newly introduced PC character Abby. The story centers on topics of revenge and forgiveness. Most examples for today will concern the second game. Coming to my research. I will shine 3 spotlights, as I have introduced before, on my finding. As you see from this slide, they are each examples from the larger context of each subchapter of the whole bigger chapter. The first is concerned with very concrete negotiations of individual characters and their gender ascriptions and discourse. The second takes a broader look at actors' interpretation of the game message and what it has to do with gender, and the third, broadest perspective, looks at negotiations that players conducted about their own discourse on the matter. The highlighted 3 subchapters here are the ones I will discuss today, but bear in mind that they are not sufficient, but just serve this spotlight focus for today. We start with the value principle following Heinrich of realism. A typical valuation of this principle would be the game is good because it is realistic, or in the negative, the game is bad because it is unrealistic. It can be categorized in the pure register of Heinrich's value register system. She defines pure valuations through an object's integrity of its link with the origin, which is a bit abstract, I know. And it includes value principles such as authenticity, purity, sincerity, preservation, and cleanliness. To make a more palpable example, this puddle looks so realistic. It shows that it is guided by an appreciation of the objects, the puddle, link to an origin in the real world. The closer the link, meaning here the representation, the better for a realism evaluation. Realism is one of the strongest quality signifiers for the Last of Us series overall. This is highlighted by all sources, developers, the game advertisement, journalists, and players' reviews. This is not surprising since on a trivial level, realism has long been the holy grail of the video game industry, be it landscape, physics, or the intricate details of human faces. Photorealism was the targeted goal. But the developer Naughty Dog has made their realistic world building to a special trademark that some deem superior to other studios in the industry. One gaming magazine wrote, for example, many virtues of the studio are clearly visible. The characters are animated excellently and feel very alive. The environment is brimming with detail and the game design is not cluttered, but reduced to an adequate core fitting the genre. Now, what happens when this value of realism gets applied to female bodies? More concretely, to Abby here on the right, and a pregnant character like Mel seen here on the left. I start with an exemplary quote of a negative valuation of the character Abby. That women are masculinized and portrayed as masculine because otherwise it's sexist in his, Neil Druckmann, the lead creative director's eyes, but female curves are completely normal and natural. Not every woman has a man's chest like Abby and muscles like a bodybuilder on testo. Dina's model actually has big breasts and not such masculine shoulders. This is all toxic, feminist bullshit from his girlfriend, Anita Sarkeesian. The core argument is the depiction of female characters is bad because they're not realistic. We can identify the values of realism in the terms normal and natural and the actuality of Dina's model. We can see here how it is not just about the commentator's perception of realism in fiction, but also how it is directly tied to the reality when they speak of this actual model in our real world. Looking for the negative in the quote, it becomes clear why realism is in fact part of this pure register family, because this lack of realism is because of this taint, this imagined taint of, or a threat, which is feminist politics and masculinization and toxic feminist bullshit. We can also clearly identify the political ideological standpoint of the speaker through their condescending remark on Anita Sarkeesian, who was one of the central targets of the Gamergate campaigns. Realism, therefore, is used as a valuation vehicle to legitimize their political standpoint through reality. So now let's have a look on the other side of the ideological spectrum. Here's a quote from an interviewee. I don't know what kind of comments there were about her character, where I think to myself, guys, I don't know. Yes, women can look like that if they pump enough, and that's also explained somewhere. She lives in this gym, practically, in Seattle, and when her character, they had models for all the characters that they scanned, and they also modeled her after that, well, I don't know, there's a model on Instagram that were practically modeled after that, right? Yes, I don't understand the criticism, don't understand it, I think it's shit. So here, the core argument is the depiction of female characters is good because it is in fact realistic. The value principle can be found in women can look like that and the models of the characters that they scanned. Additionally, she sees her body build justified through the gym setting the character is located in the game text. So this person values the object under discussion, Abby's body, in complete opposition to the quote before, but she works on the same register in similar way. Is it realistic or not? And both lines of argumentation excavate the evidence from game text and real-world origins, meaning the motion capture models. Here is a table that summarizes the key arguments for and against the question if Abby's body is realistic or not. As introduced in the example above, both sides argue through both the game text and make connections to reality. Additionally, the pro side argues with Abby's psychological state, to which the contra side has no equivalent. The terminology mirrors how one side affirms her gender and additionally argues through her status as a soldier on more gender-neutral grounds, while the critics' side focus on defamations through masculinization and, in parts, dehumanizations. On the first glance, it looks less of a value debate, but rather about facts and about who gathers the most compelling evidence for their claim. It is a common ground on which these actors can argue because the goal for realism seems like a shared value across ideologies. But I argue, in fact, it veils the underlying ethical debate. But first, another example for a pure valuation. This time it is about the value principle of authenticity, guided by the question, is a character's behavior believable within the text? For this, I turn to two pregnant women in the game, Dina and Mel. Here I will introduce the two arguments side by side. The first one reads, Mel goes on the suicidal mission with Abby, so not her best friend at all, but the person she directly tells in the game that she hates her and that she's a piece of. In that case, I would gladly throw my unborn child into combat. She's even told by several characters in the game, hey, you're really in no shape to come along. Stay here, we have enough trained soldiers. Nah, let's go. Why? Nobody knows. And the second reads, on the opposite side, pregnant women go to war. Dina wasn't sure and didn't stop until she was in the theater and was sure. Mel was the medic with years of training and combat experience. And the team always sticks together, no matter what the situation. You can see that in the scene when Abby deserted and Emmanuel joined her so that we could take out the sniper, Tommy, together. The argument of the first quote is that attachment to the other characters is not strong enough for her behavior to make sense and expresses a disbelief why she would not follow the advice of the other characters. On the other side, the commentator argues in Mel's case, not through her pregnancy, but through her profession as a medic, for her motivation to join the military mission. They are both valuations of authenticity, arguing for and against the consistency of the character, both drawing on evidence from the game text that either explain her behavior or, for the first case, make a case for their improbability. However, the subclause, I will gladly throw my unborn child into combat, with of course an ironic meaning, and the team always sticks together, unveil the underlying ethical question of the protection of unborn children in this crisis setting. Heinrich defines the ethical valuations as those that are mostly concerned with the aversion of harm. It includes principles such as charity, decency, generosity, respect, and general all moral rules and norms that govern how people live together. For both quotes, the moral obligation for women to protect their unborn child is implicitly expressed, though it is overwritten in the second one for Mel with another moral obligation, which is her loyalty to her friends. My core argument is that ethical valuations such as these are the underlying core of many of the pure valuations that discuss female bodies. The appeal of pure debates, meaning realism and character integrity for these examples, for these actors is that they seem to speak the same language and work on the same ground. Realism debates have the outward appearance of being concerned with facts that can be solved with evidence and compelling arguments, but instead they often do not share a common ground of reality. One side sees female bodies as able to build up muscle, and the other side denies that ability. It gets even more complicated when the speakers shift the discussion to the fantastic setting of an apocalypse. This is often used to avoid evidence from the actual physical reality and instead argue through the scarcity situation of the apocalypse. The protein example is one of this. This makes a common ground even more unlikely. It is not really about is, but should. The realism debate serves as the veil behind which hides an ethical difference between the actors. One side opts for the representation of women in diverse shapes and for pregnant women as independent in their life choices, while the other side sees in this representation a threat to depictions of femininity and a negligence of the welfare of the unborn. The harm that Heinrich's definition of an ethical valuation demands lies in the representational character of these depictions. It concerns what these depictions might cause in society. Here, the contra side in a rare transparent moment of the ethical argument. For example, I think it's stupid that women nowadays are told that they have to have a career and keep up with men everywhere. This makes many unhappy, and they discover too late that a career is not so important and they would have rather have had a family. Turning women into snippy Viragos, in German it's Mannsweiber, so it's man-like women, who constantly have to prove themselves is in everything and compete with men is at least as bad as wanting to forbid them to having a career in general. But it should be a free decision and not imposed by society. This comment promotes conservative family values, even though they demand freedom of choice in the end. It shows how the threat to social values feels very, very real to this commentator in a gaming discussion. The word viragos in this context refers to Abby and shows how depictions such as hers can be seen as a threat to women and their traditional role in society by certain actors. I argue that many of the realism claims are actually motivated by this threat, but the acceptance of realism-based arguments in the debate legitimizes them and makes them quite convincing at times, as this interviewee, a very, very outspoken left-wing progressive, I might say, shows. To me, Abby was never less of a woman or less feminine because of her stature. I just found it incredibly unrealistic that she was so muscular in the post-apocalyptic, where she probably couldn't get enough protein. That was the only thing I could semi-seriously see as criticism. But other than that, she was also clearly perceptible to me as a female character. While this person disagrees with the critic's defamation of her as masculine, he finds the realism argument valid and convincing. It speaks to the effectiveness and shared sense of validity of realism and pure valuations in the field. Coming to the second part. Let's have a closer look at more abstract discussions about the game's overarching message on the topic of gender. In the first sub-chapter I would write on this part, I would show how the question, if there is a message at all, is under much debate. But I skip this part for now and turn to those comments that all agree on the baseline that there is an ideological message in the game text. Once that baseline is found, the question comes up, is it good, this message? Why not? A very common answer is games should not be about politics, like this commentator states. Why do these social political issues have to contaminate every genre and medium? The vast majority of computer games are fiction and entertainment. The word game, which is Spiel in German, which is play, so the word and the thing are the same thing, is even in the name and should set the tone. This too is a pure valuation that sees games as contaminated by politics. Instead, the vision of this commentator for a pure game lies in play, since in German, the word for the activity, as I said, share the meaning. So games should stay true to their core, which is play, and stay clear of the contamination of political and social matters. Heinrich also considers ludic values as distinctive forms of valuations and worth their own register. She defines them as guided by humor, experimentation, exploration, and competition. She sees fields guided by these registers in children's activities as much as adult entertainment, sports, and of course, games. We cannot say for sure if the register's definition is really applicable here, since the commentator's demand stays quite abstract, but we can speculate that this is what they mean. Games should be about ludic values and not about serious politics. But there are also commentators that appreciate this political addition to the game. Here writes a self-described 13-year-old under a Let's Play video of The Last of Us DLC Left Behind. Nothing is actually like this. If someone is gay, it's not bad at all, and you can't compare it with heterosexuality. And some are perhaps against homosexuals, and such a game can change some, I'm sure, because for some, homosexuality is a disease. But if such a dear Ellie is a lesbian for once, some would change. This is a common notion from defenders of the title against its critics. It is good that The Last of Us does not just entertain or is fun to play as a game, but that it serves to educate people in tolerance towards homosexuality in society. It was a challenge to fit this kind of valuation into Heinrich's value registers. None of the registers would quite fit to the value principle at hand. In the end, I decided to add a register to her system. I defined the didactic register as guided by the core principle, it is good because it educates. It governs the educational system as much as missionary endeavors of religions or more secular self-realization journeys. It values the spread of wisdoms, truth, or formative experience, be they moral or factual or any other shade. It is less about seeking insight or finding it than about sharing it. Its value relies on the intention and means of transportation rather than the object it transports. To show this kind of valuation in more detail, let's have a look at a commentator who was very critical of The Last of Us 2 overall, but had this to say: "It can't be wrong to teach men that women are worth just as much as men, maybe even a little more. He himself," again it's Neil Druckmann, "also sees himself or part of himself as at risk, as you can see in this video, and wants to help Anita in her fight against misogyny and sexism. He can do this particularly well through his position at Naughty Dog, through the popularity of games such as Uncharted and The Last of Us. The fact that he rejected one of the company's most important women for this seems hypocritical. However, this creates some problems," and then it goes on and on and on. The video links to a keynote where Neil Druckmann talks about an early version of this for the storyline of Last of Us 1, which he now considers sexist, and the influence Anita Sarkeesian had on that realization. This is the most common way for critics to prove the political agenda of Neil Druckmann, and that there is indeed a connection between him and Anita Sarkeesian. However, it is not critically cited in this example, but instead with an appreciation for the intent of the mission, and also an understanding that his position enables him to do this more effectively through the popularity of the IP. This is directed towards those critics that demand a purity of the IP from politics and who say they would not be against it in a new IP, which is also a common pure valuation. The mentioning of Emmy Henning refers to a report of IGN that she was forced out of the company by Druckmann that has since been proved false, but the correction was made after this comment was posted. It shows how these commentators combine game text and information on the developers in their judgment of the titles and its message. The guiding demand is moral consistency, in the sense of live what you preach, putting Naughty Dog and especially Druckmann under special attention about their own moral behavior. The Last of Us 2 was highly applauded by German general media outlets that praised the title, especially for its potential for a positive influence on the gaming culture. The Taz, a German left-leaning newspaper, wrote, "Never before have shooter fans had to empathize with a non-heterosexual character over such a long period of time. All of this makes The Last of Us 2 a queer milestone in the gaming world. While diversity is increasingly celebrated in smaller games, The Last of Us Part 2 is a prestige title that hits the heart of the gaming scene with Sony as publisher. In the mainstream, where homosexuality and non-stereotypical images of women are still offensive, this has a high level of social relevance and great potential to get a broad mass of people used to queer identities." The focus of the argument here is that the mainstream position of the titles give them the ability to have a transformative influence on video game players that smaller titles lack. Also, this article implies that the gaming scene and shooter fans need that kind of educational input because they are still offended by homosexuality and non-stereotypical images of women. This notion brings me to the third part. Because many commentators are offended by that notion, they see themselves as wrongly represented as intolerant bigots, when in truth they are actually not that, as they say. They attack journalistic media directly for this misrepresentation, like this person does against the game magazine GameStar. GameStar is making it pretty easy for itself here to label all the bad reviews as review bombing based on people who are homophobic and simply don't like the story or similar, along the lines of, we have the power of interpretation and everyone who finds fault with the story writing itself belongs to the category outlined above or is clueless. This commentator accuses the magazine of abuse of power. They accuse them of discrediting all critics of the game with the label of homophobes. The alternative, self-ascribed label is people who find fault with the story writing. So the idea is that the critique was, in parts, or mostly, sober technical criticism. In other words, valid criticism. This quote is symptomatic of a larger debate that unfolded around The Last of Us 2 that barely touched on the game anymore, but instead focused on the discourse power dynamics that unfolded around it. It was incited by an incident of review bombing that unfolded on Metacritic right after the game release, with a series of game reviews that attacked the developers and the gender political direction of the game. Here is the date, which was short after release, and this is the score by the players, and this is the journalistic media, which were so far apart. It was, Here is a commentator who gathered some of those comments to make their own point. I picked out some typical 0 to 10 ratings on the day of release and posted them in the forum. They looked like this: The Last of Us Ultimate Woman Simulator, you get the notion, and then he closes with, if that's valid criticism for you, then we have very different ideas about it. This commentator gathered evidence in order to prove to another commentator that indeed the criticism was not constructive or valid, but quite the opposite. The beginning and ending sentences are in German, while the evidence is gathered from the English sources. This illustrates how one of the guiding struggles in these debates was determining the state of reality. Was it all homophobia? Was it all the discrediting influence of media to suppress people's opinion on the game? Who was the majority and who the minority here? What are most gamers, really? But looking back on values, my assignment was to identify what these comments say about how things should be then. To broaden the scope again, I have summarized the key narratives I found into this table. It shows the similarities and differences between the opposing sides. In terms of pure valuation, the question is who taints the discourse? The idea is that if the tainting influence could be annihilated, we would have a healthy debate culture. The defending side blames developers, media, and so-called social justice warriors of bringing the tainting influence of politics into the debate. It is indeed the same argument they make for the game itself, now applied to the discourse. The critics side, however, blame the critics of the game, saying it is their intolerant reactions that caused the discourse to derail into toxicity in the first place. Both sides share, however, that homophobia, transphobia, misogyny are bad in and of themselves, so they should not be part of the debate culture. However, they are diverging in the opinion on what counts as such. Which brings us to the next point, the ethical question. What discursive practices are considered hurtful? One side feels personally attacked when they are labeled as homophobes by the other side, while the critics' side makes a structurally similar argument about instances of personal harassment on social media against the developers and actresses. They both, in this sense, share the notion that personal attacks are not okay, but they differ in the interpretation who is the most injured party here. The same goes for content moderation practices and silencing strategies in discourse. While the defending side sees themselves as oppressed by silencing mechanism like the discrediting homophobia label, the critics' side are concerned about hate speech and express their struggle to eliminate hurtful content from the discourse. Here again, there's a lack of a shared sense of reality because content moderators from the media side see the most hurtful comments, but of course they delete them. This leads to the comment section being eventually pretty much cleansed of the worst comments. When someone then comes late to the debate, it is difficult for them to grasp what the fuss was all about. Here's a comment of a forum moderator that illustrates that struggle. Under this video alone, we've already had to delete several comments that were ranting that the lesbian shit is disgusting and the like. I never said that these are all critics of the game, but still not insignificant part. You can't leave that out of the discussion about the game. The not at all, but not insignificant illustrates that numerical problem again that I mentioned before. The fact that they had to write it down again showed that it was already deleted from the discussion, disturbing possibility to determine the scope of the problem. But again, there's a common wish on both sides for safe spaces. What I mean by that is that the defenders want to protect a space where they are free to express themselves without fear of moderation and personal attacks, while the critic side wants the space to be safe for everybody, including those that might get personally hurt by hate speech against their identities. So as I said, the difference is in the valuation of the scale of the problem and on the focus they draw. There's a tendency that the defenders focus more on us as gamers and their own hurting in the matter, while the critics look more on the larger culture and aim for gaming to be a safe and accessible space for everybody. For the scale, both sides invoke pictures of armies, either describing the social justice warriors as army that makes threatening demands for political accuracy in all media products, or the homophobe gamers as an army of trolls that spread hate and contempt. But both images speak of the same distaste for such internet warfare tactics like shitstorms or review bombings. These two sides are ideal types. They're constructed by me for this purpose. They serve to highlight the common narratives, but they also reproduce the binary that polarized the debate in the first place. That is why it's important to highlight that not every comment can be neatly fitted into these two sides. There's also a third side, I eclipsed as of yet, that I often took a moderating position between them, like this commentator did. In any case, I can't understand why you have to malign other people's attitudes. This applies to both sides of the political spectrum. Personally, I also find it problematic to assign critics of the game to the right-wing spectrum and to attack them personally in an unobjective manner. Conversely, this also means that not everyone who likes the game has been liberally brainwashed. This quote shows exemplary the rhetoric of such middle ground actors. They do share in the ethical distaste for personal attacks, which they accuse both sides of. Additionally, their language is often de-escalating, like the word problematic here in German, it's schwierig, so difficult is even weaker, and they often highlight their subjectivity, as you see personally here. I argue that these positions are not neutral or detached from the above shown discourse, but they actually answer to it by performing themselves the way they want the discourse to look like, void of personal attacks, with a differentiated and objective, whatever that means, view of both sides and a clear subjectivity label on their own opinion. This kind of performance and self-regulation practice of the discourse will be the object of the third larger empirical chapter of my thesis, which I call Conduct of Communication. Looking back at values and what values were extracted from this whole analysis in all three cases, I condensed them in this table. Bear in mind that this is just based on these three foci, and the table gets a bit more complex when it's from the whole data. Concrete characters are evaluated through their realistic appearance. For Abby's case, incongruity of behavior for the case of pregnant women, both following pure valuations. Concerning the overarching message, actors ascribed to the game pure valuations are dominant, again opting for the exclusion of tainting political influence. So far, these examples are mostly informed through the comment section data. The didactic valuation of the titles as educational tools against intolerance are more dominant in the media sample and especially in the non-gaming specific general media. When it comes to the meta discourse, lines were mostly drawn between media and commentators, although many commentators and interviewers strongly sided with the media stance as well. All these actors share distaste for personal attacks and internet warfare tactics. They differed most in the emphasis on the injured party. I argue that Heinrich value sisters, although they might appear as a quite inflexible theoretical framework, help to extract shared values from the discourse and additionally help to identify cores of the problems. The shared value of realism, a declared goal of studios such as Naughty Dog for their games, when applied to female bodies, transform into debate about women's role in society and normative claims about their appearance. The factual appearance of realism debates veil the underlying ethical and ideological discrepancies and strengthen their validity in discourse. Last slide. So finally, I want to explain what these findings and especially my emphasis on these registers mean to the overarching argument for my thesis. You see on this slide horizontally my 3 empirical chapters from the thesis. They are all chosen as such because they are the dominant topics of the debate in the franchise. I would argue that they also mirror debates representative of the whole video gaming figuration. So an abstraction from the particularities of Last of Us is probable, I would argue. What I want to focus on are the findings on the vertical axis that show how all these seemingly particular discourse frameworks share certain value negotiation structures, especially as you see here, the dominance of pure valuation with an especially strong emphasis on the value of realism, as I have introduced here, then the didactic value discourse, where I would like to focus especially on the demand for and performance of self-reflexivity as a competence worth learning and teaching to others. And finally, on the third axis, I was not able to show today, unfortunately, it concerns the affective register, so values of personal emotional attachment. Here too, I will highlight the performance of and demand for empathy. Empathy to characters, developers, media producers, players, and people in general. Thank you very much for your